After the flood destroyed my factory, my wife left me. I took the same night bus to my motel every day. I always brought the driver a coffee. Tonight, he drove straight past my stop and locked the doors. "Sit down, buddy. I saw your wife paying two guys to wait for you in the alley. Watch this. I'm glad to have you here. Follow this story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought my life would end up like this." 64 years old, sitting in a motel room that smells like disinfectant and broken dreams, watching the neon sign outside flicker on and off like a dying heartbeat. The Sunset Motel isn't the kind of place you choose. It's the kind of place you end up when everything else has been stripped away. 3 months ago, I owned Hartwell Custom Furniture, a business I'd built over 25 years. We specialized in handcrafted dining sets, bedroom furniture that would last generations. I had 12 employees, a workshop that smelled like sawdust and possibility, and a bank account that let me sleep peacefully at night. Then the floods came in March, and the Cumberland River decided to rewrite my story in a single devastating night. I can still remember standing in what used to be my workshop, watermarks reaching halfway up the walls, every piece of equipment rusted beyond repair. The insurance adjuster, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, shook his head as he calculated my losses. $300,000 in damage, he said, not looking at me. Unfortunately, flood damage isn't covered under your current policy. That's when I learned the difference between having money and having nothing. It happens faster than you think. Kimberly took the news about as well as I expected. We'd been married 15 years and I thought I knew her. I thought I understood the woman who'd walked down the aisle when she was 24 and I was 49. People whispered about the age difference back then, but I genuinely believed we loved each other. I believed she saw something in me worth staying for. "This is temporary," she said that first week after the flood, her voice tight as she packed her clothes into suitcases. "I just need time to think, Thomas, to figure out what we're going to do." She was standing in our bedroom, the bedroom we'd shared for over a decade, but she wouldn't look at me. Her hands moved quickly, efficiently, like she'd been planning this moment long before the water ever rose. I watched her fold the silk blouses I'd bought her for Christmas, the ones she said made her feel beautiful. "Where will you go?" I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "My sister's place in Nashville." She paused, a black dress clutched in her hands, "just until we figure this out." That was April 15th. I know because I wrote the date on a napkin and kept it in my wallet, thinking she'd call in a day or two, thinking this was just shock. Just fear talking. I was wrong. The bank took our house on May 3rd. I remember the exact date because it was the same day I realized Kimberly wasn't coming back. Her phone went straight to voicemail. When I called her sister, I got a recording saying the number had been disconnected. By May 10th, I was living in room 17 at the Sunset Motel, paying $250 a week for a space barely larger than my old walk-in closet. The wallpaper was peeling. The carpet had stains I didn't want to identify, and the air conditioning unit rattled like it was breathing its last breath. But it was a roof, and it was all I could afford. The job at Morrison Security came through a temp agency. Night shifts, $8 an hour, watching empty office buildings while the rest of the world slept. It wasn't much, but it gave me $500 a week, enough to keep paying for the motel and buy food from the gas station down the street. That's how I ended up on the number 47 bus every night at 10:30, riding 40 minutes across town to spend 8 hours walking empty hallways. The bus was old, probably from the 1980s, with torn vinyl seats and windows that didn't quite close properly. But the driver was kind. Arthur Clemens was maybe 58, with gray hair that stuck up in the back and laugh lines that suggested he'd found reasons to smile, despite driving a city bus for 30 years. He always wore the same navy blue uniform, always had a thermos of coffee beside his seat, and always greeted every passenger like they mattered. "Evening, Thomas," he'd say when I climbed aboard, exact change in hand. "How you holding up tonight?" Most drivers barely acknowledged passengers. Arthur made eye contact. He remembered names. In a world that had suddenly become cold and indifferent, that small kindness meant more than he could have known. After my first week of taking his bus, I started bringing him coffee from the gas station. Nothing fancy, Just black coffee in a paper cup, maybe $3, including the tip for the night clerk. Arthur's face lit up the first time I handed it to him. You don't need to do that, he said, but his hands wrapped around the cup like it was precious. I appreciate it, though. Gets lonely on these late runs. I know the feeling, I said, and we shared a look that needed no explanation. The routine became the only stable thing in my life. Take the bus at 10:30, give Arthur his coffee, sit in the same seat 3 rows back, watch the city blur past in streaks of yellow and red light. The office building where I worked was downtown, 23 floors of glass and steel that housed an accounting firm, a law practice, and several smaller businesses. My job was simple. Walk the floors every hour, check that doors were locked, make sure nobody was there who shouldn't be. It gave me time to think. Too much time, actually. I'd walk those empty hallways, my footsteps echoing off polished floors, and I'd think about Kimberly, about where she was, what she was doing, whether she ever thought about our 15 years together, whether any of it had been real. She'd call sometimes, maybe once every 2 weeks, always from a different number, always with the same excuse. I'm still figuring things out, Thomas. I need more time. Her voice sounded different on those calls, harder somehow, like she was reading from a script. I'd ask if we could meet, talk in person, maybe work things out. She'd always have a reason why that wasn't possible. Always something vague about needing space, needing clarity. The last time she called was 3 weeks ago. I was sitting in my motel room, watching a rerun of an old Western on the small television that came with the room. The phone rang and I answered on the second ring, hoping it was her. Thomas. Her voice was businesslike, almost cold. I need you to sign some papers. My heart jumped. Maybe this was it. Maybe she wanted to try again, wanted to file something with the insurance company, wanted to start over. What kind of papers? Legal stuff. For the divorce. The words hit like a physical blow. I'll drop them by your work sometime. The security desk can hold them. Divorce? I could barely get the word out. Kimberly, we haven't even talked about. There's nothing to talk about, Thomas. We both know this is over. Her voice softened slightly, but it felt calculated rather than genuine. I'm not the same person I was when we got married. People change. Situations change. I could find another job, I said quickly. Something better. We could start over somewhere new. It's not about money. But even as she said it, I could hear the lie. Everything was about money. Everything had always been about money. I've already moved on, Thomas. You should too. The line went dead. I sat there holding the phone for maybe 10 minutes, listening to the dial tone, waiting for her to call back and tell me it was all a mistake. She never did. That night, riding the bus to work, Arthur noticed something was wrong. He always noticed. You look like someone ran over your dog, he said as I handed him his coffee. Everything all right? I considered lying, telling him I was fine, keeping my problems to myself like I'd been doing for months. Instead, I found myself saying, my wife wants a divorce. Arthur nodded slowly, like he'd suspected this was coming. How long you been married? 15 years. The number felt heavy in my mouth. She left when I lost my business, said she needed time to think. And now? Now she says she's moved on. I sat down in my usual seat, feeling older than my 64 years. Guess I was the only one who thought we still had a chance. Arthur was quiet for a long moment, navigating through downtown traffic. Then he said, some people stick around for the good times and disappear when things get hard. Others stick around through everything. Sounds like you married the wrong kind. The simple truth of it cut deep, but it also felt like permission to stop hoping. Stop waiting for her to come back. Stop believing that love could survive when everything else had failed. But that night, walking the empty corridors of the office building, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Kimberly's call had felt wrong somehow, too scripted, too final. In 15 years of marriage, even during our worst fights, she'd never been that cold, that dismissive. I told myself I was imagining things, that grief was making me paranoid, But as I stood at the security desk looking at my reflection in the dark windows, I couldn't escape the feeling that there was more to this story than she was telling me. The papers she'd mentioned never showed up. Days passed, then weeks, and nothing came to the security desk. When I tried calling the number she'd used, it was disconnected. When I tried her sister's house again, a stranger answered and told me no one by that name lived there. It was like Kimberly had vanished completely, leaving me with questions I couldn't answer and a growing certainty that everything she'd told me was a lie. The feeling started small, like an itch you can't quite reach. I'd be walking to the gas station for my usual dinner, a microwaved sandwich and a bottle of water, and I'd catch a glimpse of someone in my peripheral vision. When I'd turn to look, there'd be no one there. Just shadows and parked cars and the ordinary bustle of people living their lives. At first I chalked it up to stress. Losing everything tends to make a man jumpy, and I figured my nerves were just catching up with the reality of my situation. But after 2 weeks of feeling eyes on me, I started paying closer attention. There was a man in a gray jacket who seemed to be at the gas station every time I stopped by. He'd be browsing the magazines or checking his phone by the coffee machine, always facing away when I looked in his direction. Another man, taller, with a baseball cap pulled low, showed up at the bus stop 3 different evenings. He never got on the bus, just stood there smoking cigarettes until Arthur pulled away. I mentioned it to Arthur one night, trying to keep my voice casual. "You ever notice people acting strange around the bus stops?" Arthur glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed with concern. "Strange how?" "People who show up but don't actually ride the bus, people who seem to be watching." Even saying it out loud made me feel paranoid, like an old man seeing conspiracies where none existed. But Arthur didn't dismiss my concerns. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, navigating through evening traffic with practiced ease. "You know, Thomas," he said finally, "in 30 years of driving this route, I've learned to pay attention to things that don't fit the pattern. People who stand around bus stops without getting on buses, that's definitely something that doesn't fit." "So you've noticed them too?" "Last week there was a guy at the Morrison building stop, just standing there when I dropped you off, still standing there when I came back through an hour later. Didn't look like he was waiting for anything in particular." Arthur adjusted his mirrors, checking something behind us. "Tonight, there's a dark sedan that's been following us for about 10 minutes, staying back but making the same turns we are." My stomach tightened. "You think someone's following me?" "I think someone wants you to think they're following you. Question is why." Arthur's voice was steady, but I could hear the concern underneath. "You got any idea who might want to keep tabs on you?" The honest answer was no. I was nobody special, just an old man who'd lost his business and his wife working a minimum wage job to pay for a motel room. I had no enemies, no debts significant enough to warrant this kind of attention. But then I thought about Kimberly's phone call, about the cold efficiency in her voice when she'd mentioned divorce papers that never materialized. "My ex-wife called a few weeks ago," I said slowly. "Said she was sending papers for me to sign, legal documents, but nothing ever showed up." Arthur nodded thoughtfully. "What kind of legal documents?" "She didn't specify, just said it was for the divorce." I paused, remembering the conversation more clearly now. "Actually, she asked about my work schedule. Wanted to know which shift I was working when I'd be at the building to receive the papers." "And you told her?" "Yeah, 10:30 to 6:30, 5 nights a week." The realization hit me like cold water. She knows exactly when I'm traveling, exactly which bus I take. Arthur was quiet again, but I could see him checking his mirrors more frequently. "Thomas, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. In the 15 years you were married to this woman, did she ever show interest in things like life insurance?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, but something in Arthur's tone made me take it seriously. I thought back through the years of our marriage, trying to remember conversations about insurance, about finances, about planning for the future. "She handled most of the paperwork for the business," I said slowly. "Insurance policies, benefits, that kind of thing. Said she was better with details than I was." I paused, a memory surfacing. "Actually, About 6 months before the flood, she suggested we increase my life insurance policy. Said we should protect our future, make sure we were covered if something happened to me. How much? $200,000. It seemed reasonable at the time. I was the primary earner and the business was doing well. She said it would give us peace of mind. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. You think that's relevant? Arthur didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked, have you signed any papers lately? Anything your wife sent or brought by or asked you to take care of? No. Like I said, the papers she mentioned never showed up. But even as I said it, I remembered something else. 3 weeks ago, a woman had approached me at the gas station, professional looking with a clipboard and a friendly smile. She'd said she was from my old insurance company, updating beneficiary information after my address change. Actually, I said, my mouth suddenly dry, there was someone. A woman with a clipboard, said she was updating my insurance records. I signed some forms, gave her my new address. Arthur's hands tightened on the steering wheel. What did she look like? Blonde hair, maybe mid-30s, well-dressed. She had proper paperwork, knew details about my policy that seemed legitimate. I tried to remember more specifics, but the interaction had been brief, routine. She said it was standard procedure when a policyholder changed addresses. Thomas, I need to tell you something. Arthur's voice was careful, measured. I've been driving city buses for 30 years. Before that, I worked security for a private investigation firm. I've seen enough to recognize when someone's being set up. The words hit like a physical blow. Set up for what? I don't know yet, but between the people watching you, the timing of your wife's phone call, and now this insurance paperwork, someone's been very busy making sure all the pieces are in place for something. Arthur took the exit toward downtown, but instead of heading directly to my building, he took a longer route through side streets. The question is what they're planning and how long we have to figure it out. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what he was telling me. The idea that Kimberly might be involved in something sinister seemed impossible. Yes, she'd left when things got bad, but that didn't make her a criminal. People fell out of love. People got scared when their security disappeared. That didn't mean they were capable of... Capable of what? I asked out loud, realizing Arthur hadn't actually specified what kind of setup he thought this was. Arthur was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. Thomas, when someone updates a life insurance beneficiary and then has people following the policyholder, there's usually only one reason. They're making sure they'll be in the right place at the right time to collect. The implication hung in the air between us like poison gas. My wife, my ex-wife, was planning something that would result in her collecting on my life insurance policy. And there was only one way that could happen. She wants me dead, I whispered, the words feeling unreal even as I spoke them. I think she wants it to look like an accident, Arthur corrected. Arthur, which means we need to be very, very careful about where you go and when you go there. We pulled up to the Morrison building, and Arthur turned in his seat to look at me directly. Listen to me carefully. I want you to work your shift like normal tonight, but I want you to pay attention to everything. Every person you see, every car that doesn't belong, every sound that seems out of place. And tomorrow night we're going to have a different conversation about what happens next. I got off the bus feeling like I was walking in a dream, or maybe a nightmare. The familiar routine of checking in with the night security desk, collecting my keys and radio, walking the empty floors felt different now. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every strange noise could signal danger. At 2 a.m, while making my rounds on the 15th floor, I called the insurance company from my cell phone. The automated system let me check my policy status without speaking to a human. The policy was active, premium paid through the end of the year. Beneficiary, Kimberly Ann Hartwell. She was still listed as my wife, still set to receive $200,000 if something happened to me. And according to the paperwork that blonde woman had shown me, my address had been updated to reflect my new residence at the Sunset Motel, which meant someone knew exactly where I lived, exactly when I was most vulnerable, and exactly how much money my death would be worth. I spent the rest of my shift checking locks and rechecking them, jumping at every settling sound the old building made. By morning, I was exhausted, paranoid, and absolutely certain that Arthur was right. That Tuesday night started like any other. I climbed aboard the number 47 bus at 10:30, Arthur's coffee in hand, trying to shake off the paranoia that had been eating at me for weeks. The coffee was still hot. I'd bought it just minutes before from the gas station, where the night clerk had given me his usual nod and wished me a safe shift. "Evening, Thomas," Arthur said as I dropped my exact change into the fare box. But something was different in his voice tonight. There was tension there, a careful control that made me look at him more closely. "Everything all right?" I asked, handing him the coffee. Arthur accepted the cup but didn't take his usual appreciative sip. Instead, he set it carefully in the cup holder beside his seat and checked his mirrors with more attention than normal. "Get settled in your usual seat," he said quietly. "We need to talk, but not yet." I made my way to the third row back, the worn vinyl seat creaking under my weight. The bus was nearly empty tonight. Just me, an elderly woman near the front with a bag of groceries, and a young man in headphones slumped against a window. Nothing unusual there. Arthur pulled away from the curb with his typical smooth acceleration, and we merged into the light evening traffic. For the first 15 minutes, everything seemed normal. We made our usual stops, picked up a few passengers, dropped off the grocery woman at her corner. The young man got off near the University District, leaving just me and Arthur and the hum of the diesel engine cutting through the night air. That's when I noticed we weren't following our usual route. Instead of taking Madison Avenue toward downtown, Arthur had turned onto a residential street I'd never seen before. Tree-lined, quiet, with houses that had been built in the 1950s and maintained with obvious care. Porch lights glowed warmly behind neat hedges, and I could see the blue flicker of television screens through curtained windows. "Arthur," I said, leaning forward in my seat, "I think you missed the turn." "No," he said, his voice steady but grim. "I didn't miss anything. Thomas, I need you to listen to me very carefully. We're not going to your building tonight. At least, not the usual way." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean? What?" Arthur pulled the bus over to the side of the quiet street and engaged the parking brake. The air brakes hissed as they locked, and suddenly the only sound was the idle of the engine and the soft whisper of the air conditioning. He turned in his seat to face me, his expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. "About an hour ago, I was finishing my dinner break at the depot. I drove past your motel on my way back to start my shift just to check on things." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There was a woman in the parking lot, blonde, well-dressed, talking to two men beside a dark sedan." "What kind of men?" "The kind you don't want to meet in a dark alley." Arthur's hands were steady on the steering wheel, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Big guys, rough-looking. One of them had his hand inside his jacket in a way that suggested he wasn't carrying a wallet. I felt my mouth go dry. "You think it was Kimberly?" "I'm sure it was Kimberly. I got a good look at her when she turned toward the streetlight. Same woman from the photo you showed me last week." Arthur had asked to see a picture of my ex-wife after our conversation about the insurance paperwork. I'd shown him one from my wallet, a snapshot from our 10th anniversary dinner. "She was handing them something, looked like money, and pointing toward your room." The words hit me like ice water. "She was paying them to hurt me." "Thomas, she was paying them to kill you." Arthur's voice was gentle but firm. "I watched them for about 10 minutes. They went over the plan 3 times. One man covers the front of the motel, the other waits in the alley behind the building. They're planning to corner you when you come back from work tomorrow morning." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he was telling me. My ex-wife, the woman I'd shared a bed with for 15 years, the woman who'd cried at our wedding, who'd held my hand through her father's funeral, had hired men to murder me. "How can you be sure that's what they were planning?" Arthur reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. "Because I parked close enough to hear every word." He pressed play, and Kimberly's voice filled the small space of the bus. It was her, unmistakably, but there was a coldness in her tone that I'd never heard before. He gets back to the motel every morning at 7:15. Takes the same route through the alley because the front entrance is usually crowded with the breakfast crowd from the diner next door. A man's voice, gravelly and impatient. You sure he'll have the route tomorrow? He's worked the same schedule for 2 months. He's a creature of habit. Kimberly's laugh was bitter. That's part of what made this so easy to plan. Another man's voice. What about witnesses? The alley's isolated. No cameras, no foot traffic at that hour. You'll have plenty of time to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Her voice was businesslike, discussing my death like it was a routine transaction. Just make sure it's quick. I don't want him to suffer. The recording ended, leaving us sitting in silence broken only by the rumble of the bus engine. I felt numb, like I was floating outside my own body, watching this happen to someone else. She doesn't want me to suffer, I said finally, my voice hollow. How thoughtful of her. Arthur turned the recorder off and slipped it back into his pocket. There's more. After they finished going over the plan, she gave them an envelope. Thick one. I'd guess there was at least $5,000 in there, maybe more. Down payment? That's what it sounded like. The rest when the job's done. Arthur checked his mirrors again, a habit that seemed more pronounced tonight. Thomas, this isn't just about insurance money. A woman doesn't hire professional killers over $200,000. There's something else going on here. I thought about that for a moment, trying to remember anything from our marriage that might explain this level of planning, this depth of betrayal. She handled all the financial paperwork for my business. Insurance, taxes, vendor contracts. She had access to everything. Did you ever check what she was doing? Verify the paperwork. I trusted her. The words tasted bitter now. She was my wife. I thought she was protecting our interests. Arthur nodded grimly. Trust is a beautiful thing until someone weaponizes it against you. He put the bus in gear but didn't pull away from the curb yet. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to drive you past your motel, but we're going to stay on the main street. I want you to look toward the alley behind the building and tell me what you see. We drove in silence for about 10 minutes, winding through residential neighborhoods before merging back onto the main thoroughfare. The Sunset Motel came into view, its neon sign casting pink and blue shadows across the cracked parking lot. Arthur slowed as we approached, giving me a clear view of the building. There, I said, pointing toward the narrow alley that ran behind the motel. 2 men, one by the dumpster, one near the fire escape. Same 2 from earlier, Arthur confirmed. They've been in position for about 3 hours now, waiting for you to come home from a shift that ended 2 hours ago. It was surreal, seeing my own would-be killers standing casually in the shadows, probably checking their phones or smoking cigarettes while they waited for me to walk into their trap. If Arthur hadn't been paying attention, if he hadn't cared enough to check on me, I'd be dead by sunrise. What now? I asked. Now we call the police, Arthur said, pulling out his cell phone. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe, somewhere these guys can't find you. What about my things, my clothes, my medication? Thomas, your medication won't do you much good if you're dead. Arthur's voice was patient but firm. We can worry about replacing your belongings later. Right now, we need to worry about keeping you alive. As he dialed 911, I found myself thinking about the coffee I'd brought him every night for the past 2 months. $3 worth of kindness that had saved my life. If I'd been the kind of passenger who just paid his fare and kept to himself, Arthur never would have gotten invested in my welfare. He never would have driven past my motel to check on things. He never would have positioned himself to overhear Kimberly's conversation with her hired killers. This is Arthur Clemens, city bus driver, badge number 4789, he said into the phone. I need to report a planned murder in progress. While Arthur gave the police dispatcher our location and details about what he'd witnessed, I stared out the bus window at the motel where I'd been living for the past 2 months. Room 17, with its peeling wallpaper and rattling air conditioner, had been a refuge from the worst period of my life. Now it was a crime scene waiting to happen. The dispatcher asked Arthur to stay on the line while units were dispatched to the scene. We sat in the bus, engine idling, watching the alley through the windshield like we were observing some deadly wildlife in its natural habitat. "Arthur," I said quietly, "why did you get involved?" Most people would have minded their own business. He was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "About 5 years ago, my wife died. Cancer. Long battle. Lot of pain." His voice was steady, but I could hear the old grief underneath. For months after the funeral, I was going through the motions. Working my shifts, going home to an empty house, not really living. "What changed?" "A passenger, old guy, probably about your age, rode my bus every Tuesday for his dialysis treatments. One Tuesday, he didn't show up. Next week, same thing. Third week, I drove by his apartment building after my shift just to check." Arthur paused, watching as police cars began arriving at the motel, their lights flashing but sirens silent. "Found him dead on his kitchen floor. Heart attack. Been there for over a week." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The thing was, if I'd checked on him that first Tuesday, if I'd cared enough to make sure he was okay, he might have lived, might have gotten help in time. Arthur turned to look at me. I decided that night I wasn't going to let anyone else die alone if there was something I could do to prevent it. Through the windshield, we watched as police officers surrounded the two men in the alley. Even from this distance, I could see the moment they realized they'd been caught. No dramatic chase, no gunfire, just the quiet efficiency of professionals who'd been outmaneuvered by a bus driver who cared enough to pay attention. "They're going to want to talk to you," Arthur said as more police cars arrived. "Going to want your statement about the insurance policy, about your wife's behavior, about everything that led up to this. Will you stay with me?" "As long as you need me to." I watched as the police led the two men away in handcuffs, and I realized that tomorrow morning I'd wake up alive. Not because I was smart or strong or lucky, but because a stranger had decided my life was worth protecting. "Arthur," I said, "I don't know how to thank you." He handed me his coffee cup, still warm, still untouched from when I'd given it to him hours earlier. "Drink this," he said with a small smile. "We're going to be here for a while." Detective Sarah Martinez had the kind of steady, professional demeanor that made you feel like you were in capable hands. She was maybe 45, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that seemed to see everything without judging any of it. When she interviewed me at the police station that morning, she listened to my story with the patience of someone who'd heard stranger things than a 64-year-old man's wife, trying to have him killed for insurance money. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, setting down her coffee cup and opening a thick file folder. "I need you to understand that what we've uncovered goes significantly beyond what Mr. Clemens witnessed last night." Arthur sat beside me in the small interview room, having refused to leave despite my insistence that he'd done enough already. The recording device on the table between us hummed quietly as Detective Martinez organized her paperwork. The two men we arrested last night were very cooperative once they realized they were facing conspiracy to commit murder charges. Turns out, killing people for money loses its appeal when you're looking at life in prison. She pulled out a stack of photographs. James Riley and Marcus Webb. Both have extensive criminal records: robbery, assault, weapons charges, professional muscle for hire. The photos showed the men I'd seen in the alley, but looking at their faces in bright light made the reality of what had almost happened hit home. These weren't desperate amateurs. They were experienced killers who'd been paid to end my life. "How much did she pay them?" I asked. $10,000 total. 5 up front, 5 when the job was completed. Detective Martinez's voice was matter-of-fact, but I could see sympathy in her eyes. "For these two, that's a fairly standard rate for what they call a clean removal." Arthur shifted in his chair beside me. "You said this goes beyond what I witnessed. What else did you find?" Detective Martinez pulled out another set of documents. "We executed a search warrant on Mrs. Hartwell's residence this morning. What we found suggests this has been in the works for quite some time." She spread several papers across the table. Even upside down, I could recognize my own signature on multiple documents. Insurance forms, beneficiary updates, address changes, all bearing my name, but none of which I remembered signing. "She's been forging your signature for at least 6 months," the detective explained. Not just for the life insurance policy, but for several other documents as well. A loan application using your business as collateral, a credit card in your name with a $15,000 limit, a second mortgage on your house that you knew nothing about. The room seemed to tilt around me. A second mortgage? Taken out 3 weeks before the flood destroyed your business. $50,000 with you listed as the sole borrower. Detective Martinez's voice was gentle but relentless. The timing suggests she knew about the flood risk before you did. Arthur leaned forward. How could she know that? We're still investigating, but preliminary evidence suggests she had access to weather reports and flood projections through a contact at the County Emergency Management Office. Someone who was feeding her information about potential flood zones in exchange for money. I felt sick. She knew the flood was coming and she didn't warn me. It appears she wanted your business to be destroyed, Mr. Hartwell. The insurance policy on the building specifically excluded flood damage, which she would have known when she helped you select the coverage. But your life insurance policy had no such exclusions. The full scope of her betrayal was starting to come into focus, and it was worse than anything I'd imagined. She's been planning this for months. Longer than that. Detective Martinez pulled out another document. We found records showing she's been in contact with Mr. Riley and Mr. Webb for almost a year. Text messages, phone calls, even a few in-person meetings. She's been building toward this for a very long time. Arthur's voice was tight with anger. What was her endgame? Kill Thomas? Collect the insurance money and disappear? Actually, it was more sophisticated than that. She's been building a new identity for herself in Nashville. New social security number, new background history, even a fake employment record. Once she collected the life insurance payout, she was planning to disappear completely. New name, new life, no trace of Kimberly Hartwell ever existing. I stared at the documents spread across the table. My wife's handwriting mingled with my forged signature on papers that were designed to destroy my life and fund her escape. 15 years of marriage, and I'd been nothing more than a long-term investment that had finally matured. Where is she now? I asked. That's the interesting part. Detective Martinez's expression grew more serious. When we went to arrest her this morning, she wasn't at her sister's house in Nashville. According to the sister, Kimberly left yesterday evening and didn't say where she was going. A chill ran down my spine. She knows the plan failed. We think so. The men we arrested last night were supposed to check in with her by 6 this morning. When they didn't, she probably realized something had gone wrong. The detective paused, checking her notes. We've put out a BOLO alert for her vehicle, and we've frozen her bank accounts. She can't get far without money. Arthur frowned. Unless she has cash hidden somewhere, which she does. Detective Martinez pulled out bank statements. Over the past 6 months, she's been withdrawing large amounts of cash from accounts tied to the loans she took out in your name, Mr. Hartwell. We estimate she has access to at least $30,000 in untraceable currency. The betrayal kept getting deeper. Not only had she planned to kill me, but she'd been stealing from me for months to fund her escape plan. Every signature she'd forged, every document she'd falsified, every lie she'd told me about needing time to think. It had all been part of a systematic destruction of everything I'd built. Detective, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. What happens now? Now we find her. And in the meantime, you're going to need somewhere safe to stay. She's already proven she's willing to hire killers, and $30,000 can buy a lot of determination. Arthur spoke up before I could respond. He can stay with me. I've got a spare room and I'm retired military. I know how to watch for trouble. I turned to look at him, overwhelmed by his continued generosity. Arthur, you've already done so much. Thomas, this isn't charity. It's what decent people do for each other. His voice was firm but kind. Besides, I've got a feeling this isn't over yet. He was right. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, while Arthur and I were eating lunch at his kitchen table, Detective Martinez called with an update. They'd found Kimberly's car abandoned at a bus station 40 miles outside the city. Security cameras showed her boarding a Greyhound bus to Atlanta. But when police met the bus at its destination, she wasn't on it. She could be anywhere by now, the detective said over the phone, her frustration evident. She planned this escape route as carefully as she planned everything else. What about the men she hired? I asked. Are they talking? They're singing like canaries, hoping to get reduced sentences. But here's the thing, Mr. Hartwell. They weren't the only ones she contacted. According to their statements, she had backup plans in case they failed. Other people she could call. Other ways to complete the job. My blood ran cold. She's not giving up. Probably not. Women like Kimberly Hartwell don't invest a year of planning just to walk away when the first attempt fails. She's likely regrouping, trying to figure out a new approach. After Detective Martinez hung up, Arthur and I sat in his kitchen in thoughtful silence. His house was small but comfortable, filled with the kind of furniture that suggested a man who'd lived alone for a while but still cared about making his space feel like home. Through the window I could see his neighbor working in a garden, an ordinary scene of suburban peace that felt surreal after the events of the last 24 hours. Arthur, I said finally, why didn't I see this coming? 15 years of marriage, and I never suspected she was capable of something like this. Arthur refilled our coffee cups, considering the question, because you're not capable of something like this. People like us, we assume other people think the way we do. We can't imagine the kind of long-term deception she pulled off because we'd never be able to live with ourselves if we did something like that. But there had to be signs, things I should have noticed. Probably, but recognizing evil requires thinking like evil, and that's not necessarily a bad thing that you couldn't do that. Arthur sat back down, studying my face. The question now isn't how you missed the signs. The question is what you're going to do with the rest of your life. It was a question I hadn't had the luxury of considering. For months I'd been focused on day-to-day survival, paying for the motel room, working enough hours to afford food, getting through each day without falling apart completely. The idea that I might actually have a future, that I might be able to build something beyond mere survival hadn't occurred to me. I don't know, I admitted. I've lost everything. The business, the house, my savings. Even if they catch Kimberly, even if she goes to prison, I'm still a 64-year-old man with nothing to show for 40 years of work. Arthur was quiet for a moment, then got up and walked to a bookshelf in his living room. He came back with a small wooden box, the kind used for jewelry or keepsakes. Inside was a business card yellowed with age. After my wife died, I thought my life was over too. Thought the best years were behind me, and all I had to look forward to was marking time until I joined her. He handed me the business card. Then I met a man who taught me something important. The card read, Clemens & Associates, Custom Furniture Restoration, in smaller print, specializing in antique repair and refinishing. I looked up at Arthur, confused. You restore furniture? I learned how from a master craftsman who taught me that broken things aren't worthless. They just need someone who knows how to fix them properly. Arthur's voice was steady, but there was something deeper underneath. Thomas, you've been treating yourself like you're broken beyond repair. But what if you're just damaged goods that need the right kind of attention? I thought about that while Arthur prepared dinner, a simple meal of grilled chicken and vegetables that tasted better than anything I'd eaten in months. As we ate, he told me about his furniture restoration business, how he'd started it as a hobby after his wife's death, and gradually built it into something that brought him both income and satisfaction. The thing about restoration work, he said, is that you can't rush it. You have to respect the original craftsmanship, understand what made the piece valuable in the first place, then carefully repair the damage without destroying the character that made it worth saving. You're talking about more than furniture, aren't you? Arthur smiled. Maybe. But I'm also talking about the fact that I could use a business partner, someone who understands woodworking, someone who knows how to build things that last. The offer hung in the air between us like a lifeline I was afraid to grab. After everything that had happened, after all the betrayal and loss and fear, the idea that someone might actually want to work with me, might see value in what I could contribute, seemed too good to be true. Arthur, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't have any money to invest. No tools, no workspace, nothing to contribute except 40 years of experience building furniture that people wanted to keep in their families for generations. Arthur interrupted gently. Thomas, I don't need your money, I need your expertise. I need someone who understands wood and craftsmanship and what it takes to create something beautiful. As we cleaned up the dishes, my phone rang. Detective Martinez again, this time with news that made my knees weak with relief and terror in equal measure. "We found her," she said without preamble. Kimberly Hartwell was arrested 2 hours ago at a bus station in Birmingham, Alabama. She was carrying a fake ID and $28,000 in cash. Is she talking? Not yet, but she will. We have enough evidence to put her away for a very long time, Mr. Hartwell. Conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, identity theft, forgery. She's looking at 25 years to life without the possibility of parole. After I hung up, Arthur and I sat on his porch watching the sun set over his quiet neighborhood. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe normally. The immediate threat was over. Kimberly was in custody. Her hired killers were behind bars, and I was alive. But more than that, I was beginning to understand that survival wasn't the same thing as living. And for the first time since the flood destroyed my old life, I was starting to think about what kind of new life I might want to build. 3 weeks after Kimberly's arrest, Detective Martinez called with an unexpected request. I was in Arthur's workshop at the time, learning how to properly sand a 1930s dining table that had been damaged by decades of neglect. The methodical work was therapeutic. Each stroke of sandpaper revealed a little more of the original wood underneath the accumulated scratches and stains. "Mr. Hartwell," Detective Martinez said when I answered the phone, "I need to ask you something that might be difficult. Would you be willing to participate in a recorded conversation with your ex-wife?" I stopped sanding, my hand frozen above the table's surface. "What kind of conversation?" "She's finally agreed to cooperate with our investigation, but only if she can speak to you first. Her lawyer says she has things she needs to explain, things that might help you understand why this happened." Arthur looked up from the antique armoire he was restoring, his expression concerned. He'd been protective of me since the night he'd saved my life, almost paternal in his attention to my well-being. I knew he wouldn't like the idea of me facing Kimberly again. "Is it safe?" I asked. "Completely. She's in custody, the conversation would be recorded, and there would be guards present. You'd be separated by reinforced glass." Detective Martinez paused. "I should tell you, Mr. Hartwell, that you're under no obligation to do this, but sometimes these conversations help victims find closure." Closure. I thought about that word as I looked around Arthur's workshop. In the past 3 weeks, working with my hands again had started to heal something inside me that I hadn't even realized was broken. The smell of wood polish, the satisfaction of bringing damaged furniture back to life, the quiet companionship of working alongside someone who understood craftsmanship. It was slowly rebuilding my sense of purpose. But underneath that healing, questions remained. Why had Kimberly chosen this path? When had our marriage become a death sentence? What had I done, or failed to do, that made killing me seem like her best option? "I'll do it," I said. Arthur shook his head. "Thomas, you don't need to put yourself through that. Some answers aren't worth the pain of getting them. Maybe not, but I need to try." The county jail was a modern facility built from concrete and steel, designed more for function than comfort. Detective Martinez met me in the parking lot, along with a victim's advocate named Mrs. Chen, who explained what to expect during the conversation. "She may try to manipulate you," Mrs. Chen warned as we walked through the security checkpoint. "People facing lengthy prison sentences often attempt to shift blame or generate sympathy. Remember that you're here by choice, and you can end the conversation at any time." The visiting room was smaller than I'd expected, divided down the middle by a wall of reinforced glass with built-in phones for communication. On my side were molded plastic chairs bolted to the floor. On the other side, Kimberly sat waiting. She looked different than I remembered. Thinner, paler, with her blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail instead of the elaborate style she'd favored during our marriage. The orange jumpsuit made her look younger somehow, vulnerable in a way that was probably calculated to generate exactly that impression. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears. Real ones, as far as I could tell, though after everything that had happened, I no longer trusted my ability to distinguish between genuine emotion and performance. I picked up the phone on my side of the glass. "Hello, Kimberly." "Thomas." Her voice was soft, shaking slightly. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't." She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I know you must hate me. I know you must think I'm a monster." I looked at her through the glass, this woman I'd shared a bed with for 15 years, and tried to feel something. Anger, hurt, betrayal, any of the emotions I'd expected to experience. Instead, I felt mostly sadness. Sadness for the time wasted, for the trust destroyed, for the person she'd apparently never been. "I don't hate you," I said honestly, "but I don't understand you either. That's why I'm here." Kimberly took a shaky breath. "It started small, Thomas. Little lies, little deceits. I told myself I was protecting you from things you didn't need to worry about." "What kind of things?" "Money problems. I was gambling, online poker mostly, and I'd gotten in deeper than I could handle. At first I used my own credit cards, then our joint account. When that wasn't enough, I started forging your signature on loan applications. I remembered Detective Martinez showing me the paperwork, my signature reproduced with practiced precision on documents I'd never seen." "How long were you stealing from me?" 3 years. The admission came out in a whisper. By the time I realized how bad it had gotten, I owed almost $100,000 to people who don't accept payment plans. $100,000. Our entire savings account, the equity in our home, probably more. I thought about all the times she'd handled our finances, all the statements she'd said she'd review, all the trust I'd placed in her to manage our life together. "Why didn't you tell me? We could have worked something out, found a way to deal with it." Kimberly laughed, but there was no humor in it. "With what money, Thomas? Your business was barely breaking even. We were already stretched thin with the mortgage and bills. If you'd known how much I owed, you would have left me. So instead, you decided to have me killed." "No." The word came out sharp, desperate. "That wasn't the plan. Not at first. I thought the flood would solve everything." I felt my stomach turn cold. "You knew about the flood before it happened." "I had a friend at the county emergency office. He told me about the weather patterns, about the risk assessment for our area. I knew there was a good chance the river would overflow in March." Her voice became clinical, detached. "I checked our insurance policies. The business was covered for flood damage, but our personal property wasn't. I thought if we lost the house but kept the business insurance payout, we could start over somewhere new." The casual way she discussed destroying our home, our life together, was almost worse than the murder plot, but the business insurance didn't cover floods either. I found that out too late. After the flood hit, after everything was destroyed, I realized I'd made a mistake in reading the policy. Kimberly's voice cracked. Suddenly we had nothing, and I still owed all that money to people who were getting impatient. "So you moved on to Plan B?" "The life insurance was always there, Thomas. $200,000, enough to pay off my debts and start over." She looked at me through the glass, her expression pleading. "I told myself it would be quick, that you wouldn't suffer. I told myself you were already miserable living in that motel, working that terrible job." The logic was so twisted, so self-serving that I almost laughed. "You convinced yourself that killing me was a mercy. I convinced myself that it was the only way out for both of us." Tears were streaming down her face now. "Thomas, you have to understand, these people I owed money to, they weren't going to wait forever. If I couldn't pay them, they were going to hurt me, maybe kill me. So you decided to get me killed instead. I thought it would solve everything. The insurance money would cover my debts, you wouldn't have to live with the shame of losing everything, and I could disappear somewhere safe." She pressed her hand against the glass. "I know how it sounds, but in my mind it was the best solution for everyone." I stared at her through the reinforced glass, trying to reconcile this calculating stranger with the woman who used to cry during sad movies, who'd held me when my father died, who'd promised to love me in sickness and in health until death do us part. Apparently she'd taken that last part more literally than I'd realized. "What about the forgeries? The fake insurance paperwork? How long were you planning this?" Kimberly wiped her nose with a tissue. "About 8 months. Once I realized the gambling debts were never going away, I started thinking about alternatives. I researched how life insurance payouts work, what kind of documentation they require, how to make a death look accidental. You researched how to murder me. I researched how to solve an impossible problem. Her voice hardened slightly. Thomas, you weren't listening to me during those last few months of our marriage. You were so focused on the business, so absorbed in your own world that you didn't notice I was drowning. And there it was, the shift Detective Martinez had warned me about, the attempt to make this partially my fault, to suggest that if I'd been a better husband, she wouldn't have been forced to plan my murder. So this is my fault for not noticing you were stealing from me and planning to have me killed? No, that's not what I meant. What did you mean, Kimberly? She was quiet for a long moment, her hand still pressed against the glass between us. When she spoke again, her voice was different, smaller, defeated. I meant that I'm sorry. I meant that I destroyed everything good in my life because I was too proud to ask for help and too scared to face the consequences of my mistakes. She looked directly at me for the first time since I'd sat down. I meant that you deserve better than a wife who saw killing you as a solution to her problems. The conversation lasted another 20 minutes, but nothing else she said mattered much. She answered my questions about the details. How she'd found the men she hired, how she'd planned to collect the insurance money, where she'd intended to go afterward. But the essential truth was simple. She'd been in trouble, and rather than face it honestly, she'd chosen to eliminate the person who trusted her most. When I hung up the phone and walked out of the visiting room, Detective Martinez was waiting with the paperwork for me to sign. My statement about the conversation would be part of the evidence used in her sentencing hearing. How do you feel? Mrs. Chen asked as we walked back to the parking lot. Empty, I said honestly. I thought I'd feel angry or betrayed or something dramatic. Instead, I just feel like I wasted 15 years of my life with someone I never really knew. That's not uncommon, she said gently. Sometimes the hardest part of these situations is accepting that the person we thought we loved was never real to begin with. Arthur was waiting in his truck when I came out of the building. He'd insisted on driving me to the jail, saying he didn't want me to be alone afterward. As we drove back to his house, I told him about the conversation, about Kimberly's explanations and justifications and apologies. Do you believe her? He asked when I finished. I thought about that as we turned into his neighborhood, past the neat houses with their well-maintained lawns and the kind of quiet stability I'd never appreciated until it was gone. I believe she's sorry, I said finally. I believe she's scared and desperate and probably genuinely regretful about how things turned out. But I also believe she would have gone through with it if you hadn't intervened. I believe she would have collected that insurance money and slept just fine in her new life while I was buried in some cheap cemetery. Arthur nodded. Some people are sorry they did something wrong. Other people are just sorry they got caught. That evening, as I helped Arthur apply a final coat of varnish to the dining table we'd been restoring, I realized something important. The conversation with Kimberly hadn't given me closure. It had given me perspective. For months, I'd been torturing myself with questions about what I could have done differently, how I'd failed as a husband, whether I bore some responsibility for the destruction of my marriage. Now I understood that some people are simply willing to do things that others can't imagine. Some people will lie and steal and betray and justify it all as necessary for their survival. And recognizing that truth wasn't defeat. It was liberation. Arthur, I said as we cleaned our brushes, tell me more about this business partnership you mentioned. He smiled, and I saw something in his expression that I'd been seeing more often lately. Hope. I was thinking we could call it Second Chances Furniture Restoration. What do you think? 8 months after Kimberly was sentenced to 25 years without the possibility of parole, I stood in the workshop that Arthur and I had built together, running my hand along the smooth surface of a restored Victorian writing desk. The wood gleamed under the fluorescent lights, every scratch and water stain carefully removed, every joint reinforced, every detail returned to its original beauty. Second chances. Furniture restoration had started in Arthur's garage, but word of our work had spread through the community faster than either of us had expected. People brought us family heirlooms that had been damaged by time or neglect, pieces that held memories too precious to discard but too broken to use. We gave them back their functionality and their dignity, and in return, we found something we'd both been missing: purpose. The insurance investigation had eventually uncovered most of the money Kimberly had stolen from me. Not all of it. Some had been lost to her gambling, some spent on planning my murder, but enough to give me a foundation for starting over. Combined with Arthur's savings and the income from our restoration work, we'd been able to lease a proper workshop space and purchase the tools we needed to do the job right. I was adjusting the hardware on an antique armoire when Arthur called from the front of the shop. "Thomas, someone here to see you." I set down my screwdriver and walked to the front room, where we displayed finished pieces and met with customers. A woman in her 50s stood admiring a refinished oak dining table, her fingers tracing the restored carving along its edge. "Mr. Hartwell." She turned when she heard my footsteps. "My name is Carol Brennan. Detective Martinez gave me your information." I recognized the name from news reports. Carol's husband had been killed in an apparent robbery 6 months earlier, but police had recently arrested his business partner in connection with the murder. Like me, she'd discovered that someone she trusted had been planning her family's destruction. "Detective Martinez said you might understand what I'm going through," Carol continued, her voice carefully controlled. "She said you'd survived something similar." Arthur appeared from the back room, wiping his hands on a shop rag. He'd become expert at reading my moods, knowing when I needed support and when I needed space to handle things myself. This felt like a moment for support. "Would you like some coffee?" Arthur offered. We were just taking a break anyway. The three of us sat in the small office space we'd created in one corner of the workshop. Carol told us her story, how her husband's business partner had been embezzling money for years, how the man had killed her husband to prevent discovery of the theft, how she'd learned that the person offering comfort during her grief had been the one who'd caused it. "The worst part," she said, accepting a cup of coffee from Arthur, "is how stupid I feel. Everyone keeps telling me it wasn't my fault, that I couldn't have known, but I keep thinking there must have been signs I missed." I understood exactly what she meant. For months after Kimberly's arrest, I'd tormented myself with the same questions. How had I failed to see the woman I'd married for who she really was? What kind of husband doesn't notice that his wife is stealing from him and planning his murder? "The signs were there," I said honestly. "Looking back, I can see them clearly. But the reason I missed them wasn't because I was stupid or naive. It was because I'm not capable of that level of deception myself, so I couldn't imagine someone else being capable of it." Carol nodded, tears starting in her eyes. "People keep saying I should feel angry, but mostly I just feel lost. Like everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie." "Some of it probably was," Arthur said gently, "but not all of it. The love you felt was real. The memories you made were real. The person you thought you were married to, that person existed in your mind and heart even if they didn't exist in reality." Over the next hour, Carol told us about the financial investigation, the arrest, the upcoming trial. Her husband's business partner had stolen over $300,000 from their company, money that should have secured their retirement. Now she was facing not only the loss of her husband, but the loss of their financial security. "I don't know how to start over," she admitted. "I'm 53 years old. I haven't worked outside the home in 20 years. I don't even know who I am without him." I thought about that question, about the difference between starting over and continuing forward. 6 months ago, I'd thought my life was essentially finished. 64 years old, no money, no home, no prospects, betrayed by the person I'd trusted most. If someone had told me then that I'd be running a successful business with a friend who'd risked his own safety to save my life, I would have thought they were delusional. "Carol," I said, "can I show you something?" I led her to the back of the workshop, where we kept the pieces that were in various stages of restoration. Arthur followed, understanding where I was going with this. "See this rocking chair?" I pointed to a piece we'd been working on for several weeks. When the owner brought it in, it was barely recognizable. The seat was split. 2 of the rockers were cracked. The finish was completely destroyed. She told us it had been her great-grandmother's chair, that 4 generations of women had rocked their babies in it. Carol examined the chair, which was now about halfway through the restoration process. The structural repairs were complete, but we hadn't yet applied the final finish. The owner wanted to throw it away. Arthur continued, said it was too far gone to save, that she should just buy a new one. But look at it now. The chair was beautiful, its original craftsmanship revealed through careful repair and attention. The wood grain that had been hidden under decades of damage was now visible, and the elegant curves of its design were once again apparent. It's not the same chair it was when it was first made, I explained. Some of the wood had to be replaced, some of the joints had to be rebuilt entirely. But it's still fundamentally the same piece, still capable of serving its purpose, still valuable to the family that owns it. Carol ran her hand along the arm of the chair, understanding the metaphor. You're saying I can be repaired. I'm saying you're not as broken as you think you are, Arthur said. Damaged, yes. Changed, absolutely. But not beyond repair. We talked for another half hour about practical matters, financial planning, career possibilities, support groups for people who'd survived similar betrayals. Carol had a college degree in accounting that she'd never used professionally, skills that could translate into employment if she was willing to update her training. Detective Martinez mentioned that you might be looking for someone to help with bookkeeping, Carol said as she prepared to leave. I know my situation makes me less than ideal, but actually, I interrupted, it makes you exactly ideal. We need someone who understands what it's like to have your trust betrayed, someone who won't take advantage of the faith we're placing in them. Arthur nodded. Someone who knows that second chances are precious things, not to be wasted. We agreed that Carol would start part-time, handling our invoicing and customer records while she took evening classes to update her accounting skills. It wasn't a permanent solution to her problems, but it was a beginning, a way to start rebuilding her life one small step at a time. After Carol left, Arthur and I returned to our respective projects. He was working on a mahogany sideboard that had been water damaged in a basement flood. I continued with the Victorian writing desk, carefully adjusting each piece of brass hardware until it operated with the smooth precision the original craftsman had intended. You know, Arthur said after we'd worked in comfortable silence for a while, I never told you what made me start paying attention to you on the bus. I looked up from my work, curious. In the months we'd been friends and business partners, Arthur had shared many stories about his life, but he'd never explained what had prompted him to get involved in my situation. It was the coffee, he said, applying wood stain with careful, even strokes. Not just that you brought it, but the way you brought it. Like it mattered to you whether I had a good night or a bad one. Most passengers, they get on, they pay their fare, they ignore the driver. You made eye contact, you asked how I was doing. You treated me like a person instead of just a service. I thought about those nights on the bus, how Arthur's kindness had been the only bright spot in my increasingly dark world. I'd brought him coffee because it was the only way I could think of to return some small measure of the humanity he'd shown me. $3 worth of coffee, I said, shaking my head in amazement. That's what saved my life. No, Arthur corrected gently. Treating another human being with basic decency is what saved your life. The coffee was just how you chose to express it. As evening approached, we began cleaning our tools and preparing to close the shop for the day. It was a routine we'd developed over the months, a quiet ritual that marked the transition from work to personal time. Arthur would go home to the house where he'd lived alone since his wife's death, but now he had plans for his evenings, books to read, projects to work on, sometimes dinner with friends he'd reconnected with since his life had taken on new meaning. I would go back to the small apartment I'd rented 3 blocks from the workshop, a place that was simple but clean and entirely my own. No moldy motel rooms, no flickering neon signs, no reminders of the lowest point in my life. Just a comfortable space where I could cook my own meals, read in my own chair, and sleep without worrying about who might be waiting for me in dark alleys. Thomas, Arthur said as we locked up the shop, I've been thinking about expanding. Maybe taking on a larger space, hiring an assistant, really growing this thing into something significant. What did you have in mind? There's a building for sale about 6 blocks from here. Used to be a car repair shop, but it's got good bones and plenty of space for a proper showroom. I was thinking we could display finished pieces, maybe even take custom orders for new furniture built in traditional styles. The idea excited me more than I'd expected. For the first time since losing my original business, I was thinking about growth instead of mere survival, about building something larger than ourselves, something that could outlast us. How much would something like that cost? More than either of us has individually, Arthur admitted. But together, with the business credit we've established and the reputation we're building, I think we could make it work. As we walked to our respective vehicles, I thought about the strange path that had brought us to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been a broken man living in a motel room, abandoned by everyone I thought I could count on. Now I was planning the expansion of a business I'd built with a friend who'd risked everything to save my life. "Arthur," I said as we reached his truck, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been paying attention that night? If you'd just driven your route and minded your own business?" He was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I wonder about a lot of things, but mostly I'm grateful that I learned to pay attention to the people around me. My wife used to say that we're all connected in ways we can't see, that small acts of kindness ripple outward in directions we never expected." "She sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was, and she would have liked you." Arthur smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "She would have said that saving your life was just the universe's way of saving mine, too." As I drove home through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, I reflected on the truth of that statement. Arthur had saved my life in the most literal sense, but in the process, he'd also given his own life new meaning. Our friendship, our business partnership, our shared commitment to restoration and second chances, it had transformed both of us. At home, I made a simple dinner and sat at my kitchen table reading a book about advanced woodworking techniques. Outside my window, I could see the lights of other apartments, other lives being lived with ordinary purpose and quiet satisfaction. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged in that ordinary world. My phone rang as I was getting ready for bed. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, and for a brief moment, I felt an echo of the old fear. But Kimberly was in prison, her conspirators were behind bars, and the threats to my life were over. "Mr. Hartwell?" The voice belonged to a young woman, nervous but determined. "My name is Janet Morrison. I got your number from Carol Brennan. She said you might be able to help me." Another referral, another person whose life had been shattered by betrayal and who was looking for guidance on how to pick up the pieces. I listened as Janet told me about her situation. A business partner who'd been embezzling, a discovery that had cost her both her livelihood and her faith in her own judgment. "Carol said you understood what it was like to start over after something like this," Janet said. "She said you'd found a way to build something new from the wreckage." I looked around my small apartment, thinking about the workshop where Arthur and I created beautiful things from damaged materials, thinking about the expansion we were planning, thinking about the life I'd built from the ashes of everything I'd lost. "Janet," I said, "why don't you come by the shop tomorrow afternoon? I'd like you to meet my business partner, and I think we might be able to show you something that will help you understand what's possible when you refuse to let betrayal define your future." After I hung up the phone, I sat quietly in my living room for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the city settling into sleep around me. Somewhere out there, Kimberly was lying on a narrow bunk in a prison cell, probably staring at the ceiling and thinking about the choices that had brought her to that place. I felt sorry for her in a distant way, the same kind of sadness I might feel for a stranger who'd made catastrophically bad decisions. But I didn't think about her much anymore. My focus was on tomorrow, on the new project Arthur and I would start, on the people who would come to us seeking restoration and second chances, on the life I was building one careful decision at a time.